The weekend in the woods started out as a random idea, a trip to escape from the hustle and bustle of city life. My boyfriend, Jake, was the first to receive a postcard, a picture of the Whispering Woods. The text on the back promised, "Explore the wilderness, where nature and man come together." I don't remember exactly why we were so drawn to it. The woods were in the wilds of the American Northwest, far from any towns, with no cell service or internet. Carly and Trevor, our best friends, were also interested. Carly had always been adventurous, and Trevor just wanted to relax by the campfire with beer and guitar. The day we set off, the sky was blue, the sun was bright. It all seemed like the perfect vacation. We laughed the whole way, imagining evenings around the campfire, telling ghost stories just to tease each other. But as we rolled through the rusted gate with the faint sign, "Warning, the forest is not for the faint of heart," none of us paid any attention. The path into the forest became narrower, the dense canopy blocking the sunlight. At that moment, I began to feel strangely stuffy inside the car, as if the forest was swallowing us inside. The cabin, tucked away behind a row of pine trees, looked like a forgotten fairy tale cabin. It was eerily quiet, not a sound except for the sound of the car engine idling. When we entered, we noticed that the house was old but clean, with pine walls and a stone fireplace, giving it a warm feel. Carly was delighted, and Trevor whistled, "Not bad at all." But as I walked through the front door, a chill crept up my spine. I turned around, staring at the door as if something was watching from outside. The first night went smoothly, or so we thought. We gathered around the campfire, telling silly ghost stories. Jake talked about Bigfoot, Carly sneered, saying that there was nothing to be scared of except squirrels jumping around in the bushes. But when I got to the bedroom, I noticed that the atmosphere inside the house had changed. Cold air seeped in through the cracks in the windows. I lay in bed, listening to the wind whistling through the branches. Then, in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I didn't know why I woke up. There was only darkness, and the room was unnaturally quiet. The first thing I noticed was the silence. No insects, no wind, just an eerie silence. The second day, the group decided to explore the woods. It was a breathtakingly beautiful place, with trails of fallen leaves and sunlight filtering through the trees. Carly was the first to spot the strange footprints. "What the hell are these?" She bent down, pointing a shaky finger at the ground. The prints were too large to be human, but they had 5 distinct toes and were shaped like human feet. The edges were deeply imprinted in the dirt, as if a creature weighing several tons had just walked through. The prints ran along the trail, heading into a dense section of the forest. Trevor tried to laugh. Someone must be playing a joke, but none of us felt comfortable. Jake didn't even crack a joke as usual. We kept walking, but I couldn't stop thinking about those prints, about what could have made them. A thought echoed in my head. We shouldn't be here. That night, the campfire burned brightly, but no one said much. Carly sat close to me, her eyes constantly on the forest. Trevor drank more than usual. Even Jake was unusually quiet. Around midnight, when the fire had died down, we heard it. A roar echoed from deep in the woods. Not a wolf or an owl, but a primal, growling sound, as if from something beyond imagination. We all jumped to our feet, eyes wide with fear. Trevor was the first to say, It must be a wild animal." But Carly shook her head, her lips trembling. "No, it's not natural." The roar came again, closer this time. The ground beneath our feet shook slightly. Trevor held his flashlight and pointed it at the forest, but only darkness answered. "Get in the house," Jake shouted. We rushed into the house, shut the door, but the feeling of safety did not return. In the night, I heard footsteps outside my window, heavy, slow, and stopping right in front of my room. As I lay in bed, trying to calm my rapid breathing, the footsteps outside the house did not stop. They were heavy, slow, as if the creature was deliberately prolonging our torture. Each step seemed to hit my chest, making my heart want to explode. I quietly looked through the tiny window next to the bed. The scene outside made my breath catch. In the darkness, under the pale moonlight, I caught a glimpse of a tall figure, its back hunched, as if it was sniffing something. Its stench seeped through the crack of the door, making me want to vomit. Its body was covered in thick, dirty fur, but its face, it was not the face of an animal. Its eyes glowed in the darkness, a fiery red. Suddenly, it turned its head. Although it was not clear, I felt its eyes looking straight at me through the window crack. I stepped back, covering my mouth to keep from screaming. The door to the room suddenly flew open, and Jake rushed in, whispering, "We have to get out of here. Now." "What about Carly and Trevor?" I stammered, my voice barely audible. "Carly's packing. Trevor's in the living room, guarding the door. But we can't stay here another second." A roar echoed outside, louder and closer. The wooden walls shook as if the creature were trying to break through. Jake pulled me up, his eyes full of panic. "Let's go." The group gathered in the living room, each of them pale. Trevor held the kitchen knife, as if a small blade could stand up to something so large. Carly shivered, clutching her backpack to her chest. "Where are we going?" Carly whispered, her voice almost choking. "It's out there." Jake glanced at the front door, then back to the window. "We're going to the car. We have to be quick. Trevor and I will take the lead. Carly, you stay close to Riley." I held onto Carly's hand, trying to reassure her even as I felt like crying. Jake counted, 1, 2, 3. The door swung open. The group rushed out into the darkness, no one daring to look back. The sound of hurried footsteps and gasps mingled with the cold wind whistling through the trees. The ground beneath their feet was littered with dry branches, each step stripped bare by the echoing sound. Then I heard it, roaring, almost shaking the ground. The creature was chasing us, and it was faster than I thought. Its heavy footsteps echoed behind us, and the stench filled the air. Carly screamed as she stumbled. I tried to pull her up, but her eyes were panicked. "Go!" she yelled, pushing me forward. "No, I won't leave you." I yelled back, but Jake turned, yanking me away. Carly's scream was cut off by a horrible sound, a screech and the crunch of bones. I turned my head, just in time to see the monster's massive form lift Carly up, before we both disappeared into the darkness. "Run!" Jake yelled, practically dragging me toward the car. We rushed to the car. Trevor held the keys, his hands shaking so much he could barely open the door. When the car finally started, we thought we were done. But the creature wasn't going to let us go that easily. After a few hundred yards, the headlights of the car were aimed directly at it. It was standing in the middle of the road, taller and more terrifying than ever. Blood was dripping from its long, crooked claws. Its red eyes glowed in the darkness, burning anyone who dared to look directly at it. Jake yelled, "Hit it!" Trevor screamed in panic, stepping on the gas. But as the car got closer to the creature, it jumped up, incredibly fast, and slammed into the roof of the car. The metal crunched as its claws dug into the hood, pulling so hard that the whole car shook. "Get out of here!" I yelled. "Drive!" Trevor swerved wildly. The car swerved, but eventually got away from the creature. It crashed to the ground, its angry roar echoing through the forest. But we didn't dare stop. Trevor stepped on the gas and sped out of the forest. When we reached the nearest town, shaking, covered in blood and dirt, no one believed our story. The locals just looked at us strangely, as if they knew but didn't dare say anything. An older man approached, his voice low. "You're lucky, but remember this, Whispering Woods is no place for humans. Next time, you might not make it." I never went back to that forest, but sometimes on quiet nights, I still hear its roar in my dreams, along with that glowing red eye, staring straight at me. The Whispering Woods is still there, waiting, and so is the creature. My name is Henry, and for 55 years, I served as a park ranger in Colorado. Over those decades, I've seen things that still make my skin crawl, things that go beyond any rational explanation. Some memories, no matter how hard I try, refuse to fade. One of those is the story I've come to call Hell Deer. It was the summer of 1969, and I was just 23, fresh-faced and eager to make a difference. My partner, Carl, was an older, seasoned ranger who had seen his share of bizarre events but never lost his sense of humor. On a sunny morning, we got a report of a grizzly sighting near a popular hiking trail. Grizzlies are rare but dangerous, so we wasted no time gearing up. The forest greeted us with its usual mix of beauty and foreboding. The sunlight filtered through the dense canopy, casting shifting patterns on the forest floor. Birds chirped lazily, and a distant creek murmured softly. But as we trekked deeper, a strange smell hit us. Sharp, metallic, and putrid. "Jesus, what is that?" Carl muttered, pulling a bandana over his nose. I gagged and did the same. The stench grew stronger, overwhelming the forest's usual earthy aroma. It led us to a clearing where the source of the smell lay, a massive, rotting grizzly bear carcass. Flies buzzed in clouds around it, and the ground was stained dark with blood. What the hell could have taken down a grizzly? I whispered. Carl shook his head, his eyes scanning the treeline. Then we saw it. A deer standing a few yards away, its head buried in the bear's torso. At first, I thought it was just sniffing the body, maybe out of curiosity. But then I saw the blood dripping from its mouth. The deer was eating the bear. Deer are herbivores. I'd never seen one so much as nibble on a dead animal. My gut screamed that something was wrong. Very wrong. I pulled out my pistol, my hands trembling. "Stay calm," Carl muttered, his shotgun at the ready. "Maybe it's sick or rabid." The deer lifted its head. Blood coated its muzzle, and its eyes were off. They weren't the soft, cautious eyes of a prey animal. They were glassy, empty, soulless. For a moment, we stood frozen, staring at it as it stared back. Then it screamed, not a bleat or a grunt, but a high-pitched, human-like wail that sent chills racing down my spine. Before I could react, the deer charged, its antlers aimed directly at us. Carl dove out of the way, but I wasn't fast enough. It slammed into me, knocking the wind out of my lungs. Pain exploded in my chest as its hooves thrashed against my body. "Get off him, you hell deer!" Carl roared, firing his shotgun. The blast echoed through the forest, and the deer's head exploded in a spray of blood and bone. Its lifeless body collapsed on top of me, its still warm flesh reeking of rot. Carl helped me to my feet, his face pale beneath his tan. "What the hell just happened?" he muttered. I didn't have an answer. Back at the station, the autopsy only deepened the mystery. The deer's stomach was filled with meat, bear meat, but it also showed signs of severe decomposition. According to the lab, the deer had been dead for days before it attacked us. "How does a dead deer kill a grizzly?" Carl asked, his voice low. I didn't respond. I didn't have to. The look in his eyes told me he already knew the answer. After the hell deer incident, life in the park didn't go back to normal. Not for me, not for Carl, and certainly not for the forests we patrolled. For weeks, I couldn't shake the sound of that scream or the stench of rotting flesh. It haunted my dreams, waking me in cold sweats. Carl wasn't much better. His usually steady demeanor had been replaced by a nervous edge, his jokes turning darker and more infrequent. Reports of strange occurrences began trickling in. Hikers described hearing unearthly screams echoing through the woods at night. Hunters found deer carcasses with their antlers splintered and torsos mangled, as if something had been eating them. A few campers went missing altogether, their tents shredded, their gear scattered. Officially, we blamed bears or mountain lions. Unofficially, we knew better. One afternoon, about 6 months after the incident, Carl and I were called to investigate another odd sighting. A couple of hikers claimed they'd seen a herd of deer acting strangely, circling a large tree and making guttural noises. Carl and I exchanged uneasy glances but agreed to check it out. The forest was eerily silent as we approached the location. No berzan. No squirrels darted through the trees. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. And then we saw them. A dozen deer standing in a loose circle around an ancient, gnarled tree. Their heads hung low, their bodies unnaturally still. "Why the hell are they just standing there?" Carl whispered. We crept closer, careful not to make a sound. As we approached, the deer began to sway, their movements slow and synchronized, as if they were in a trance. My heart pounded in my chest. This wasn't normal. This wasn't natural. Then one of the deer lifted its head and looked directly at us. Its eyes were the same glassy, lifeless orbs I'd seen in the hell deer. One by one, the others turned to face us, their swaying halting abruptly. Carl raised his shotgun, his hands shaking. "Henry," he muttered, "we need to leave, now." Before we could move, the deer began to scream. The sound was deafening, a horrifying mix of animalistic howls and human wails. They charged at us as a unit, their antlers lowered like spears. We turned and ran, dodging trees and leaping over roots as the herd barreled after us. The forest seemed to blur around me, my focus narrowing to the pounding of my boots and the screams behind me. We made it to a rocky outcrop and scrambled up, the deer stopping at the base. They stared up at us, their empty eyes unblinking, their bloodied mouths twisted in grotesque snarls. Then, just as suddenly as they'd started, they turned and walked away, disappearing into the forest. That night, Carl and I sat in silence at the station, nursing stiff drinks. Finally, he spoke. "This isn't some freak accident, Henry. This is a pattern." He was right. Over the next few months, the reports grew more frequent and more disturbing. Deer behaving aggressively, sometimes attacking humans or other animals. Entire herds vanishing, only for their skeletons to be found weeks later in strange formations. Tracks that led nowhere, as if the animals had simply disappeared. I began digging through old park records, looking for anything similar. What I found chilled me to the bone. There were accounts going back decades, stories of hikers disappearing, hunters encountering unnaturally aggressive deer, and unexplained noises in the forest. One report, dated 1934, described a ranger finding a deer skull nailed to a tree, its antlers wrapped in barbed wire. During one of my patrols, I met an old man named Eli who lived alone in a cabin deep in the woods. He was a recluse, rarely coming into town, but he knew the forest better than anyone. "You've seen them, haven't you?" he asked one day, his voice a rasp. "Seen what?" I replied, though I already knew. "The cursed ones," he said. "The hell deer." Eli told me a story that sounded like folklore but felt too real to dismiss. He spoke of an ancient curse placed on the land by a group of settlers who had dabbled in forbidden rituals. They believed the deer were sacred and sought to bind their spirits to the forest. But something went wrong. The rituals corrupted the animals, turning them into vessels for malevolent forces. "Once they've marked you," Eli said, his eyes narrowing, "they won't stop until they've taken everything." Eli's story rattled me, but it wasn't until a week later that I found something that made my blood run cold. While patrolling a remote area, I stumbled upon a clearing littered with bones, deer, bears, even humans. At the center of the clearing stood a large stone slab, stained dark with what could only be blood. Strange symbols were carved into its surface, their jagged lines seeming to writhe under my gaze. I didn't tell Carl about the clearing. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't want to drag them into something I didn't fully understand. But deep down, I knew I couldn't avoid it forever. I couldn't shake the image of the stone slab and the bones surrounding it. The clearing felt alive in a way that nature shouldn't. A pulsing, malevolent energy that stayed with me long after I left. I knew I needed to go back, but I wasn't stupid enough to go alone. "Carl," I said a few days later as we sat in the station, "I found something out there. Something bad." His eyes narrowed. "Bad how?" I hesitated, unsure how much to tell him. "Bones. A lot of them. And a stone slab with symbols." Carl set his coffee down. "Symbols?" His voice was low, wary. Like carvings? What kind? Not the kind you'd find in a history book, I replied. The kind that makes your skin crawl. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Finally, he sighed. Let's check it out. The hike to the clearing felt longer than it had the first time. The forest was unnaturally quiet. The usual rustle of leaves and chirping of birds replaced by an oppressive stillness. When we reached the clearing, Carl froze. Jesus Christ, he muttered, his face pale. The bones were still there, scattered like a grotesque mosaic. The stone slab loomed in the center, its dark surface glinting faintly in the dappled sunlight. Carl stepped closer, his boots crunching over the brittle remains. These symbols, he began, trailing off as he traced a finger over the carvings. They're not just random. This is, I don't know, ritualistic. I nodded, the unease in my chest growing. There's something else, I said, leading him to a nearby tree. Nailed to its trunk was a deer skull, its antlers wrapped in rusted wire. The smell of decay hung thick in the air. Though the skull looked old, the bone bleached white by time. Carl shook his head. What the hell is this place? I don't know, I admitted, but it's not natural. That night, we brought our findings to Eli. He listened in silence, his weathered face growing graver with every word. When we finished, he leaned back in his chair, his eyes distant. You found their altar, he said finally. Whose altar? Carl asked. The ones who came before, Eli replied. The settlers. They didn't just worship the deer. They tried to become one with them. They believed the deer were conduits to another realm, a realm of power. They sacrificed animals, sometimes people, to bind themselves to that power. But they didn't understand what they were inviting in. He paused, his gaze flicking between us. That altar is a gateway. It's why the forest is cursed. Why the deer aren't just deer anymore. Carl's expression hardened. How do we stop it? Eli shook his head. You don't. That place is older than any of us. Older than this forest. All you can do is stay away. But we couldn't stay away. Not when the forest was our responsibility. A week later, we got a call about a missing hiker. A man named David Walters had been camping with his family when he wandered off to gather firewood and never returned. His wife was frantic, their young son inconsolable. Carl and I led the search party. The forest was dense and disorienting, the towering pines casting long, shifting shadows. As night fell, we found David, or what was left of him. His body lay twisted at the base of a tree, his face frozen in a mask of terror. Deep gashes marred his torso, and his legs were broken at unnatural angles. But it was his surroundings that truly unnerved me. Around him, the ground was littered with strange, spiraling patterns made of sticks and stones. Symbols carved into nearby trees mirrored those on the altar slab. Henry, Carl said, his voice trembling. Look at his head. I followed his gaze and felt my stomach churn. Antlers. Thin, sharp antlers were sprouting from David's scalp. The skin stretched taut and bloodied around them. We radioed for backup and secured the area, but I knew it wouldn't be enough. Whatever was happening in the forest was escalating. Over the next few weeks, more reports came in. Hikers disappearing, animals behaving aggressively, strange symbols appearing in unlikely places. Carl and I worked around the clock, patrolling the forest, following leads, trying to make sense of the chaos. But the more we learned, the less sense it made. One night, I decided to return to the clearing alone. Carl protested, but I insisted. If we're going to stop this, we need answers, I told him. The forest felt alive as I made my way to the clearing, the trees seeming to watch me, the shadows shifting unnaturally. When I arrived, the altar looked different. Fresh blood stained its surface, and the symbols carved into it seemed to glow faintly in the moonlight. As I stepped closer, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. The scream of a deer, but this time it wasn't just one. The forest around me erupted with the sound, dozens of overlapping screams reverberating through the trees. I turned to run, but it was too late. They were there. Dozens of deer stood at the edge of the clearing, their lifeless eyes fixed on me. Some were missing patches of fur, their flesh rotting beneath. Others had antlers that twisted unnaturally, splitting into jagged, bone-like spikes. And at the center of them all stood a massive stag, its body pulsating with unnatural energy, its antlers glowing faintly in the darkness. The stag stepped forward, its gaze locking onto mine, and then, in a voice that sounded both human and inhuman, it spoke. "You should not have come." The words froze me in place. My breath hitched, my legs refusing to move. The stag loomed over the other deer, its massive antlers seeming to stretch into the darkness, almost blending with the shadowy forest canopy. Its eyes burned with an eerie light, not of life but of something far older and far worse. "You carry the mark," it said again, its voice reverberating through the clearing like the groan of ancient trees. I stumbled back, the primal instinct to run screaming in my mind, but my legs didn't obey. Instead, I whispered, "What do you want?" The stag didn't answer immediately. It stepped closer, its hooves crunching against the brittle bones scattered across the clearing. The other deer followed, their empty eyes locked on me. Then the stag spoke again. "The forest was never yours to tame. It belongs to us, and you, trespasser, will feed it." The deer surged forward, a tidal wave of rotting flesh and piercing antlers. Adrenaline surged through me, breaking the paralysis. I turned and ran, my flashlight bobbing wildly in the darkness. The screams of the deer echoed behind me, growing louder, closer. I don't know how I made it back to the station. The forest seemed to shift around me, trees closing in, paths disappearing. But somehow, I stumbled into the clearing where Carl was waiting. "What the hell happened to you?" he asked, grabbing my shoulders. "They're coming," I gasped. "The deer, the stag," it spoke. Carl didn't question me. He grabbed his shotgun and a flare gun, shoving the latter into my hands. "We're not going down without a fight." The first deer appeared at the edge of the clearing, its eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. Then another and another. Soon, the entire herd surrounded us, their guttural screams cutting through the night. "Stay close," Carl said, his voice tight. The first deer charged, its antlers aimed straight at me. I fired the flare gun, the bright light temporarily blinding it. Carl's shotgun roared, and the deer crumpled to the ground, its body twitching unnaturally. But there were too many of them. The herd surged forward, their antlers gleaming like spears in the moonlight. Carl and I fought desperately, firing at anything that moved. But for every deer that fell, 2 more took its place. "We can't hold them off," Carl shouted. Then the stag appeared. It stood at the edge of the clearing, watching us with those burning eyes. The other deer parted for it, bowing their heads as it approached. Carl fired his shotgun, but the stag didn't flinch. It kept walking, its antlers glowing faintly. "It's not real," Carl muttered. "It can't be real." But it was. The stag reared back, letting out a scream that shook the ground. The force of it sent Carl and me flying, our weapons scattering across the clearing. I landed hard, the air knocked out of my lungs. When I looked up, the stag was standing over me, its antlers glowing brighter. "You should not have come," it said again. Then everything went black. When I woke up, I was in a dark, damp place. The air was cold and heavy, the walls slick with moisture. I realized I was underground, inside a cavern or a bunker of some sort. Carl was next to me, unconscious but breathing. As I stood, I noticed strange carvings on the walls, similar to the ones on the altar, but more intricate, more deliberate. They seemed to pulse faintly, as if alive. I followed the carvings deeper into the structure, the air growing colder with every step. At the end of the tunnel, I found it. A massive chamber filled with rusted equipment, strange machines, and rows of cages. Some cages were empty, their bars bent and twisted. Others contained remains, bones, and scraps of fur. In the center of the room was a large, circular platform covered in symbols. This was where it had all started. As I examined the platform, I heard a faint whispering, like the rustle of leaves. The air grew heavier, pressing down on me. Then the stag's voice echoed through the chamber. "You cannot stop it." I turned, and there it was, standing at the edge of the platform. But this time it wasn't alone. Shadows moved around it, taking on the shapes of other animals. Wolves, bears, birds, all with the same burning eyes. "This forest belongs to us," the stag said. "You do not belong here." The shadows surged forward. I stumbled back, tripping over a rusted console. My hand brushed against a lever, and instinctively, I pulled it. The chamber filled with a blaring alarm, and the platform began to glow. The symbols on its surface pulsed brighter and brighter until the entire room was bathed in light. The shadows screamed, their forms disintegrating in the light. The stag reared back, its antlers cracking like dry wood. It let out one final, ear-splitting scream before exploding into a cloud of ash. Then everything went silent. I found Carl awake but groggy. Together, we stumbled out of the facility, the air growing fresher with every step. When we emerged into the forest, the first rays of dawn were breaking through the trees. The forest felt different, quieter, calmer. The oppressive energy that had hung over it for so long was gone. But I knew better than to believe it was over. We reported the incident to the authorities, but our story was dismissed as hysteria. The facility was sealed off, and the park was reopened to the public. But Carl and I knew the truth. The forest was alive, and it would never truly be safe. Years later, I retired, leaving the forest behind. But the memories never left me. Sometimes, I still hear the stag's voice in my dreams, warning me to stay away. And sometimes, when the wind is just right, I catch the faintest scent of decay. The forest may be quiet now, but I know better than to trust it, because some things can't be stopped. They can only be contained.
Thanks for listening to today's story. Let us know what you think. If you want to hear more scary stories, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new episode when we upload it. We'll always be here and welcome you.